The year 2025 did not become memorable because of one dominant event. It became defining because of accumulation. Across politics, entertainment, religion, sport, and media, a striking pattern emerged: the disappearance of figures who had shaped entire eras. These deaths did not occur within a single industry or ideology. They appeared scattered, unconnected, almost random. Yet taken together, they revealed something structural. What ended in 2025 was not only a series of individual lives, but a form of cultural continuity. Many of the figures who died were not simply famous. They were stabilizing reference points associated with institutions, genres, or identities that had endured for decades. Their absence exposed how dependent cultural memory had become on a shrinking group of long-standing figures. This convergence mattered because it unfolded inside a media environment that no longer pauses. Death was not followed by silence, but by instant framing, redistribution, and reinterpretation. Legacies were compressed into clips, headlines, and summaries, often stripped of the historical distance that once shaped remembrance. The past was processed at the same speed as the present. At the same time, audiences approached these losses differently than in previous decades. Public grief gave way quickly to analysis. Careers were reassessed in real time. Influence was measured not by longevity alone, but by how easily a figure could be integrated into contemporary narratives. Death did not conclude a story. It triggered a new phase of evaluation. What connects the individuals examined in this documentary is not profession, nationality, or belief. It is timing. Each death marked the closure of a specific cultural role, whether institutional, symbolic, or generational. Together, they form a map of transition, showing which forms of authority, creativity, and visibility define the past, and which no longer have successors waiting in the same form. This is not a chronicle of loss. It is an examination of what becomes visible when anchors disappear. The following figures illustrate how culture reorganizes itself when long-standing reference points exit the frame and what their departures reveal about the direction already underway. His death marked the end of a papacy defined by constant exposure rather than doctrinal rupture. Pope Francis died on April 21st, 2025, at the age of 88. According to official Vatican statements, the cause of death was a stroke followed by irreversible cardiovascular failure. The timing, immediately after Easter, reinforced the symbolic weight already attached to his role. Francis led the Catholic Church during a period in which inherited authority no longer guaranteed moral insulation. His papacy unfolded under conditions of permanent visibility, where every statement, omission, and gesture was instantly interpreted across religious, political, and cultural contexts. By the time of his death, he was less perceived as a theological innovator and more as a surface onto which global expectations and frustrations were projected. Culturally, he became associated with an attempt to reposition the church's moral emphasis toward issues such as inequality, migration, and social responsibility. These priorities expanded his relevance beyond traditional religious audiences, while simultaneously intensifying internal tensions over doctrine and continuity. Media narratives often focused on what his leadership symbolized rather than what it structurally transformed, framing his papacy as one of intention constrained by institutional limits. Institutionally, his tenure highlighted the challenge of governing a global organization whose demographic center had shifted while its power structures remained historically fixed. His death did not resolve these tensions. Instead, it exposed them more clearly. Questions about reform, governance, and relevance remained open, now detached from the figure who had come to embody them. From a generational perspective, Francis occupied an in-between role. Older adherents saw continuity shaped by modest adaptation. Younger observers encountered a leader who acknowledged change without fully delivering it. His death in 2025 closed a chapter defined not by resolution, but by negotiation, illustrating how authority in the modern era persists only while it can withstand uninterrupted scrutiny. His death was received less as breaking news than as a historical marker. Dick Cheney died on November 3, 2025, at the age of 84. According to family statements and medical reporting, the cause of death was heart failure following long-standing cardiovascular disease, an outcome consistent with decades of publicly documented health complications. Cheney's relevance at the time of his death was not tied to current political power, but to the durability of the systems he helped shape. As vice president during the early 2000s, he exercised influence in ways that redefined the modern executive branch. His authority was structural rather than rhetorical, operating through policy design, legal interpretation, and institutional precedent rather than public persuasion. Culturally, Cheney became a shorthand for a governing philosophy rooted in security primacy and executive expansion. In 2025, media framing moved away from partisan reaction and toward retrospective accounting. Coverage increasingly treated him as a case study in how crisis conditions can permanently alter democratic norms. His name functioned less as a personality and more as a reference to a method of power. Institutionally, the legacy of his tenure remained embedded in surveillance practices, military authorization frameworks, and interpretations of presidential authority that persisted across administrations of both parties. These mechanisms outlived his direct involvement, underscoring how policy architecture can continue shaping outcomes long after its architects exit public life. From a generational perspective, Cheney occupied two distinct roles. Older audiences remembered the immediacy of post-9/11 decision-making. Younger observers encountered him primarily through historical analysis and institutional critique. His death in 2025 did not close a debate, but clarified one: that modern political influence is often measured not by popularity, but by how deeply it embeds itself into systems that remain long after individuals are gone. His death closed the life of a figure whose influence long outlived his active participation in politics. Jean-Marie Le Pen died on January 7, 2025, at the age of 96. According to statements from his family and medical reporting in France, the cause of death was natural, linked to advanced age, with no acute illness publicly identified. Le Pen's relevance in 2025 was rooted almost entirely in legacy. As the founder of the Front National, he reshaped the boundaries of acceptable political discourse in post-war France. His career normalized a confrontational style that relied on provocation, repetition, and media attention to push ideas once confined to the political margins into sustained public debate. By the time of his death, these methods had become structurally embedded in European politics. Culturally, Le Pen functioned as an origin point rather than a contemporary actor. Media coverage surrounding his death focused less on his final years and more on how his rhetoric altered the mechanics of visibility. Journalists and analysts emphasized how outrage itself became a tool of political endurance, allowing positions to circulate regardless of formal power. His influence was framed as procedural, not persuasive. Institutionally, his impact was most visible in the evolution of the party he founded. Under subsequent leadership, the movement pursued legitimacy through rebranding while retaining core voter coalitions. This transformation highlighted how political organizations can distance themselves symbolically from their origins without fully severing ideological lineage. Le Pen's role persisted indirectly, shaping strategy even after his formal removal. From a generational perspective, his meaning diverged sharply. Older audiences remembered him as a disruptive presence that fractured consensus. Younger observers encountered him as historical context, often through analysis rather than lived experience. His death in early 2025 marked the end of a person, not a pattern, illustrating how political methods can survive their creators and continue influencing systems long after individual accountability fades. His death was registered quietly, but its implications were cultural rather than personal. David Lynch died on January 16, 2025, at the age of 78. According to statements from his representatives, the cause of death was complications related to emphysema, a condition he had spoken about publicly in the later years of his life. Lynch's relevance at the time of his death did not come from current projects, but from the endurance of his method. His work had long rejected narrative clarity and explanatory closure, favoring ambiguity as a structural choice. In a media environment increasingly optimized for speed, resolution, and algorithmic legibility, this approach gained renewed attention precisely because it resisted those pressures. Culturally, Lynch functioned as a countermodel to contemporary content production. His refusal to interpret his own work positioned him outside the expectation of constant self-annotation. Media framing following his death emphasized this resistance, portraying him less as a celebrity and more as an institutional figure whose influence shaped what mainstream film and television were willing to tolerate in tone, pacing, and unresolved meaning. Industrially, his legacy was visible in the normalization of elements once considered niche. Techniques such as tonal dissonance, nonlinear storytelling, and unresolved endings became acceptable within prestige television and independent cinema. While rarely replicated directly, his influence expanded the formal boundaries of narrative production across platforms. From a generational perspective, Lynch occupied multiple roles. Older audiences associated him with theatrical cinema and late 20th century experimentation. Younger viewers encountered him through fragments, essays, and digital rediscovery. His death in 2025 marked the end of an individual career, but not of a framework. It demonstrated that cultural authority can persist without accessibility, visibility, or explanation, sustained instead by a body of work resilient enough to withstand constant reinterpretation. His death marked the quiet conclusion of a career defined by structural influence rather than late-stage visibility. Robert Redford died on September 16, 2025, at the age of 89. According to family statements and medical reporting, the cause of death was natural, associated with age-related complications, and occurred peacefully without prolonged illness disclosed publicly. Redford's relevance at the time of his death extended far beyond his on-screen legacy. While his performances shaped a formative era of American cinema, his lasting impact came from how he altered the industry's architecture. He was increasingly understood not as a former leading man, but as an institutional builder whose influence continued operating independent of his presence. Culturally, Redford represented a model of authority grounded in restraint. His screen persona relied on understatement rather than spectacle, reflecting a period when credibility and continuity carried more weight than constant exposure. In 2025, this stood in sharp contrast to contemporary celebrity culture, making his legacy appear instructive rather than nostalgic in media reassessments. Media framing following his death focused heavily on his role in legitimizing independent film. Coverage repeatedly returned to the Sundance Film Festival, which he helped transform into a durable counterweight to studio dominance. At a time when streaming consolidation raised questions about creative access, Redford's infrastructure-based influence was treated as his most consequential achievement. Institutionally, the pathways he supported for independent filmmakers had become normalized, embedded within global distribution and talent development systems. These structures persisted even as their economic foundations shifted, underscoring how influence rooted in systems can outlast changes in technology and taste. From a generational perspective, Redford occupied dual meanings. Older audiences remembered cinematic presence. Younger observers encountered him primarily through institutional legacy. His death in 2025 did not diminish his relevance. It clarified it, demonstrating how cultural authority endures most reliably when it is built into frameworks rather than sustained. Through visibility alone, his death brought closure to a career that had already concluded on its own terms. Gene Hackman died in February 2025 at the age of 95. According to reports confirmed by family representatives, the cause of death was heart disease compounded by age-related complications. His passing occurred shortly after the death of his wife, reinforcing the sense of a final chapter long removed from public life. Hackman's relevance in 2025 was defined by absence rather than activity. Having retired from acting years earlier, he existed as a benchmark rather than a participant. His performances were frequently cited as reference points for credibility, restraint, and authority, particularly in roles tied to institutions such as law enforcement, the military, and government. Newer portrayals were often measured against the standards he had established. Culturally, Hackman represented a form of screen presence rooted in discipline rather than charisma. His authority did not rely on idealization or spectacle, but on procedural realism and moral ambiguity. In a media environment increasingly oriented toward heightened identity and constant self-display, this approach appeared distant, yet structurally influential. Media framing following his death emphasized completion. Coverage focused on the deliberate nature of his withdrawal from Hollywood, interpreting it as a refusal to participate in an industry that had shifted toward perpetual visibility. Hackman was framed less as a retired celebrity and more as a finished body of work, closed to reinterpretation through new output. Institutionally, his films remained embedded in acting education and genre analysis. Crime dramas and political thrillers continued to draw on techniques he normalized, underscoring how foundational methods persist beneath evolving styles. From a generational perspective, older audiences associated him with an era of skepticism toward power, while younger viewers encountered him through curated rediscovery. His death in 2025 reinforced a central idea. Cultural authority can be preserved not through adaptation, but through consistency followed by withdrawal. His death reframed a career long defined by tension between individuality and system demands. Val Kilmer died on April 1, 2025, at the age of 65. According to medical reporting confirmed by family representatives, the cause of death was pneumonia, following years of health complications related to throat cancer that had significantly reduced his public presence. Kilmer's relevance in 2025 was rooted not in recent output, but in reassessment. Once positioned as a leading man within the studio system, his trajectory came to symbolize how talent does not always align smoothly with industrial expectations. His performances moved between blockbuster visibility and highly stylized personal interpretations, often resisting the consistency studios rely on to maintain momentum. Culturally, Kilmer came to represent artistic volatility rather than instability. Media narratives that once focused on conflict and unpredictability shifted after his death toward contextualization. His career was increasingly framed as an example of how creative intensity can clash with production schedules, branding discipline, and long-term franchise logic without erasing cultural impact. Media coverage in 2025 emphasized this reframing. Retrospectives highlighted how his most durable roles gained renewed attention through digital rediscovery and rewatch culture. Rather than fading, his work circulated differently, detached from box office cycles and reassessed through performance analysis rather than celebrity narrative. Institutionally, Kilmer's career exposed the fragility of star systems built on uninterrupted alignment. Once that alignment breaks, visibility can disappear quickly. Yet his posthumous relevance demonstrated that performances capable of sustaining reinterpretation can outlast the structures that originally contained them. From a generational perspective, older audiences remembered theatrical releases and media controversy. Younger viewers encountered Kilmer through archival clips, documentaries, and online analysis. His death in 2025 did not close his story. It clarified it, illustrating how artistic identity can survive disruption, illness, and withdrawal, persisting through the durability of work rather than the continuity of presence. His death marked the quiet end of a figure whose influence had long been absorbed into the structure of popular music itself. Brian Wilson died on June 9, 2025, at the age of 82. According to family statements and medical reporting, the cause of death was natural, linked to age-related complications after years of widely documented physical and mental health challenges. Wilson's relevance in 2025 rested almost entirely on legacy rather than activity. As the primary creative force behind the Beach Boys, he reshaped what mainstream pop music could contain, expanding it emotionally, harmonically, and technically. By the time of his death, his innovations were no longer perceived as experimental departures, but as foundational elements embedded across genres. Culturally, Wilson became synonymous with the introduction of vulnerability into mass market music. His work shifted pop away from surface optimism toward introspection and psychological complexity without abandoning accessibility. Media framing after his death emphasized this transformation, presenting him less as a troubled genius and more as an architect of a new emotional vocabulary that subsequent generations normalized. Institutionally, his impact was visible in recording practice itself. Techniques he pioneered in the studio became standard, shaping production norms, authorship models, and the concept of the studio as an instrument. Music education, criticism, and retrospective rankings consistently treated his work as a benchmark for compositional ambition within commercial frameworks. From a generational perspective, Wilson occupied multiple symbolic roles. Older audiences associated him with a specific period of American cultural optimism and its unraveling. Younger listeners encountered his influence indirectly through artists and sounds shaped by his legacy rather than through direct fandom. His death in 2025 did not diminish his presence. It clarified how deeply his ideas had already migrated into the system, demonstrating how innovation can disappear into normality while continuing to define its limits. His death signaled the closure of a figure whose career traced the full institutionalization of cultural transgression. Ozzy Osbourne died on July 22, 2025, at the age of 76. According to statements from his family and medical reporting, the cause of death was natural, following prolonged health complications, including Parkinson's disease and injuries that had progressively limited his mobility in his final years. Osbourne's relevance at the time of his death was defined less by recent musical output than by endurance. As the former frontman of Black Sabbath and a long-standing solo artist, he embodied the transition of heavy metal from marginal subculture to globally recognized genre. By 2025, that transition was complete, and Osbourne functioned as a living archive of its early confrontations with mainstream norms. Culturally, he represented the normalization of shock. Imagery and themes once framed as threatening to public morality became historical reference points rather than active provocations. Media framing after his death emphasized this shift, portraying Osbourne not as a disruptive force, but as evidence of how repeated exposure converts controversy into heritage. What once provoked institutional backlash had become part of cultural memory. Institutionally, his career reflected how subcultural movements are absorbed without being erased. Heavy metal, once excluded from critical legitimacy, had entered museums, award institutions, and academic study. Osbourne's role in that progression was treated as structural rather than anecdotal, highlighting how longevity can transform opposition into recognition. From a generational perspective, Osbourne occupied layered meanings. Older audiences remembered the period when his presence symbolized cultural rupture. Younger audiences encountered him through mediated formats such as reality television, archival clips, and retrospectives rather than direct musical discovery. His death in 2025 did not end his influence. It finalized a transformation, demonstrating how rebellion, sustained long enough, becomes reference, and how figures associated with excess can ultimately be preserved as institutional history. His death prompted a reassessment of how spectacle became system. Hulk Hogan died on July 24, 2025, at the age of 71. According to medical reporting and family statements, the cause of death was natural, linked to age-related complications following years of cumulative physical strain from an extended wrestling career. Hogan's relevance in 2025 was not tied to active performance, but to the architecture of modern sports entertainment. As a central figure of professional wrestling's mainstream expansion in the 1980s, he helped convert a regional attraction into a global media product. His persona was engineered for television, merchandising, and repetition, establishing a template that outlasted individual storylines. Culturally, Hogan represented a simplified form of heroism designed for mass alignment. His character relied on moral clarity, exaggerated physicality, and direct audience identification. Media framing after his death emphasized how this construction shaped collective memory, showing how performance can generate authenticity through familiarity rather than realism. In retrospect, his image revealed the mechanics of belief within mediated spectacle. Institutionally, his impact was embedded in the wrestling industry's transformation into a multimedia enterprise. Character branding, cross platform promotion, and serialized narratives became standardized practices during his rise. These structures persisted even as audiences grew more critical and performers more self aware, underscoring how early frameworks continue to govern contemporary production. From a generational perspective, Hogan occupied divergent meanings. Older audiences associated him with childhood spectacle and cultural saturation. Younger viewers encountered him primarily through archival footage and analysis rather than live events. His death in 2025 did not erase his influence, it clarified it, illustrating how mediated identities can outgrow their creators and continue shaping how entertainment manufactures legitimacy, loyalty, and scale long after the central figure exits the frame. His death abruptly interrupted a career defined by efficiency rather than spectacle. Diogo Jota died on July 3, 2025, at the age of 28. According to official police and club statements, the cause of death was a car accident in which he and his brother were killed when their vehicle lost control and caught fire, an incident that sent shockwaves through European football. Jota's relevance at the time of his death was rooted in function, not mythology. Operating within elite club football and the Portuguese national team, he represented a modern athlete optimized for tactical systems. His value lay in adaptability, spatial intelligence, and efficiency rather than individual showmanship, reflecting how contemporary football increasingly prioritizes integration over stardom. Culturally, his death exposed the fragile line between elite performance and ordinary vulnerability. Media coverage emphasized the contrast between his disciplined, low-profile public image and the sudden finality of the accident. Narratives focused less on celebrity and more on interruption, framing his passing as a reminder of how careers built on consistency can vanish without narrative closure. Institutionally, the response highlighted football's dependence on players who operate below the level of global superstardom but form the backbone of competitive systems. Clubs, leagues, and federations frame Jota as representative of a cohort whose importance is measured internally through metrics and outcomes rather than branding. His death prompted renewed discussion about workload, travel, and the constant physical and logistical demands placed on elite athletes. From a generational perspective, Jota symbolized a new professional archetype. Younger fans encountered him through analytics, highlights, and tactical breakdowns rather than mythic storytelling. His death in 2025 transformed him from an active component of modern football into a reference point, illustrating how contemporary sporting legacies can be defined not by longevity, but by the sudden absence of figures whose value was embedded deeply within the system rather than projected outward. Her death marked the final separation between a living person and a figure that had already become historical. Brigitte Bardot died on December 28, 2025, at the age of 91. According to statements from those close to her, the cause of death was natural, linked to age-related complications after years of withdrawal from public life. By the time of her death, Bardot's relevance no longer depended on activity or visibility. She existed primarily as a cultural construct formed in the mid-20th century, when cinema, fashion, and mass media converged to create a new model of celebrity. Her image had long outlived her film career, continuing to circulate independently of her participation. Culturally, Bardot represented a decisive shift in how femininity was displayed and consumed. Her screen presence combined sexual autonomy with emotional distance, disrupting earlier conventions, without aligning neatly with later frameworks of empowerment. Media reassessments following her death focused on this tension, framing her less as an individual performer and more as a turning point in the visual language of desire and fame. Media coverage also emphasized her early rejection of celebrity culture. Bardot's withdrawal from filmmaking and public life was increasingly interpreted as an early response to the psychological costs of sustained visibility. In 2025, this decision resonated strongly, as debates around exposure, autonomy, and the price of fame had become central to cultural discourse. Institutionally, her influence extended beyond cinema into advertising, fashion, and celebrity branding. The mechanisms that amplified her image became foundational templates for the global entertainment industry. Even as those systems faced critique, they continued to operate using structures first normalized during her rise. From a generational perspective, Bardot occupied divergent meanings. Older audiences remembered immediacy and saturation. Younger observers encountered her through archival imagery and critical analysis rather than lived experience. Her death in 2025 did not end her presence. It finalized a transition, demonstrating how certain figures cease to function as people long before they disappear as symbols, leaving behind images that continue shaping cultural memory without requiring renewal. His death underscored the heightened volatility of political life in the early 2020s. Charlie Kirk died on September 10, 2025, at the age of 31 after being shot during a public event at Utah Valley University in Orem, Utah. Official reports state he was killed by gunshot wounds sustained while speaking at a Turning Point USA gathering, an attack that authorities treated as an assassination during a period of rising political violence in the United States. Kirk's relevance at the time of his death derived from his role in reshaping youth. Political engagement. As co-founder and executive director of Turning Point USA, he had built one of the most visible conservative advocacy organizations focused on mobilizing students and young adults. His work extended beyond campus activism into media, podcasts, and national campaigns, amplifying his voice as a prominent advocate for conservative causes within a polarized political landscape. Culturally, Kirk embodied a generation of activists who blurred the boundaries between grassroots organization, media presence, and political strategy. Coverage following his death focused on how his influence had extended into debates over faith, identity, and cultural alignment, with his style and rhetoric contributing to ongoing discussions about political polarization. Media narratives also highlighted the immediate questions his death raised about safety at public events and the broader consequences of political violence. Institutionally, his passing had immediate impact on the organization he helped build. Turning Point USA's leadership transitioned to his widow, Erica Kirk, who was appointed CEO and chair of the board shortly after his death, signaling an effort to maintain continuity within the movement he helped forge. This shift illustrated how organizational structures adapt when a central figure is removed suddenly from the scene. From a generational perspective, Kirk's trajectory reflected a moment when political influence was measured not only by formal office, but by capacity to mobilize networks and shape media discourse. Younger activists encountered his work through digital platforms and live events, while broader audiences engaged with his legacy through news coverage of both his activism and the circumstances of his death. His assassination in 2025 made him a reference point in ongoing debates over political expression, public safety, and the evolving role of activist leadership. Her death reframed a career that had unfolded largely under early visibility and quiet endurance. Michelle Trachtenberg died on February 26, 2025, at the age of 39. She was found in her New York City apartment, and the New York City Office of Chief Medical Examiner later determined the cause of death to be complications related to diabetes mellitus, classifying it as a natural death. Trachtenberg's relevance in 2025 rested on the way her career intersected with the evolution of youth-oriented television. Beginning as a child performer and transitioning into prominent serialized roles, she became associated with a period when cable and network television shaped generational identity through long-form storytelling. Her work contributed to the normalization of genre television as a space for sustained character development rather than disposable entertainment. Culturally, her career illustrated the durability of performances created before the era of constant personal branding. Media framing following her death emphasized how her visibility had been concentrated within specific roles rather than maintained through continuous public exposure. This distinction positioned her as emblematic of a cohort whose cultural impact was built through repetition and narrative attachment, not omnipresence. Media coverage also revisited the structural pressures faced by performers who enter the industry young. Rather than focusing on celebrity trajectory, reporting centered on longevity, health, and the limited pathways available for reinvention within a system that often freezes early success into permanent association. Her death sharpened these discussions without attaching speculation to intent or circumstance. Institutionally, the shows associated with Trachtenberg's career continued to circulate through streaming platforms, reinforcing how earlier television models still feed contemporary distribution systems. From a generational perspective, older viewers remembered scheduled broadcasts and communal viewing, while younger audiences encountered her work through rediscovery. Her death in 2025 marked the end of a life, but also clarified how cultural presence can persist quietly, sustained by narrative memory rather than continuous visibility. Their death marked a sudden rupture in the formal recognition of drag as mainstream entertainment. The Vivienne died in January 2025 at the age of 32. Authorities confirmed the cause of death as an accidental ketamine overdose, a conclusion that framed the event as a public health issue rather than a criminal matter, while underscoring the risks associated with unregulated substance use. At the time of death, the Vivienne occupied a historically specific role. As the first winner of the UK edition of a globally franchised drag competition, they represented the point at which drag performance fully crossed into primetime legitimacy. Their career demonstrated how an art form rooted in subculture could be formalized, televised, and institutionally validated without losing technical discipline. Culturally, the Vivienne embodied drag as structured performance rather than provocation. Precision, impersonation, and theatrical control defined their work, reinforcing drag's lineage within stage tradition. Media framing after their death emphasized this professionalism, positioning them less as a countercultural figure and more as evidence that drag had become a recognized craft within mainstream entertainment economies. Coverage also reflected a broader recalibration in how queer performers were discussed. Rather than focusing on identity as spectacle, reporting centered on labor, visibility, and the pressures associated with rapid elevation from subcultural circuits to national platforms. The circumstances of their death were treated with restraint, reinforcing advertiser-safe norms while still acknowledging structural stressors surrounding performance culture. Institutionally, the Vivienne's success had already influenced casting practices, commissioning decisions, and touring circuits, expanding pathways for drag performers within regulated entertainment systems. Their death in 2025 did not reverse this shift, but it exposed the fragility that can exist beneath professionalization. From a generational perspective, the Vivienne functioned as both pioneer and reference point. Older audiences encountered them through televised competition and national media. Younger audiences engaged through clips, commentary, and digital circulation. Their death closed a singular career, but it also fixed a moment in which drag's transition from underground practice to institutional form became irreversible, leaving behind a framework that continues to shape how performance, legitimacy, and visibility intersect. What emerged from 2025 was not a single cultural collapse, but a pattern of closure. Across religion, politics, entertainment, sport, and media, the deaths examined in this documentary mark the end of roles that had once functioned as stabilizing anchors. These figures were not interchangeable celebrities. They were reference points associated with specific systems of authority, visibility, and meaning that had endured for decades. Taken together, their passing revealed how culture now processes loss. Death no longer creates distance. It triggers acceleration. Careers are condensed, legacies reframed, and influence redistributed almost immediately. What once unfolded over years now occurs in days. The result is not erasure, but compression, where complexity is reduced to fit the speed of circulation. At the same time, these deaths exposed a structural shift already underway. Many of the roles these individuals occupied no longer have direct successors. Institutions remain, but the figures who embodied them have thinned. Authority persists, but it is less personalized. Cultural memory remains active, but increasingly provisional, shaped by platforms rather than ritualized remembrance. Looking forward, several possibilities remain open. Cultural influence may continue fragmenting, with fewer figures able to dominate entire eras. Institutions may rely more heavily on systems than personalities. Audiences may grow less attached to individuals and more attuned to patterns, treating public figures as temporary carriers of larger structures rather than enduring symbols. None of these outcomes are certain, but all are consistent with trajectories already visible. What is clear is that legacy itself has changed. It is no longer secured by longevity alone, nor finalized by death. It is continuously reassembled through reinterpretation, repetition, and relevance to the present moment. The figures discussed here are remembered not only for what they created, but for what became visible once they were gone. If this documentary has offered clarity, it is in showing that 2025 was not defined by who died, but by what their absence revealed. To continue following how culture reorganizes itself around loss, transition, and succession, you can support this series by liking the video and following the channel. Doing so helps future chapters build on this analysis. As new figures rise and older reference points disappear, one question remains open. In a system that no longer pauses, what determines which lives become lasting frameworks and which fade into context once attention moves on? The next installment will examine emerging figures and whether the structures they enter still allow for endurance or only for rotation.